I'm Libby Tyler, and here today is Vivian Kahn. And so we're going to have just have a discussion and talk to each other. We've both been planners for a long time in the Bay Area and other places. And you know what? Well, I guess I should further say I'm still working for the city of San Pablo, Community Development Director, but I'm looking forward to retiring and doing some part-time work soon. And currently, I'm also the section director for the northern section of the California chapter of the American Planning Association, which I love to say is the largest section and the largest chapter in the world. But Vivian, I was remembering one of my first memories of you. And that was going down to the basement, the lower level at the city of Berkeley. And I was working as a contract planner. And I knew you before, but I remember seeing you. And this was back in the mid to late 80s. And You were the zoning administrator, and you were running the building and the zoning and a busy counter. And I was so impressed. And I knew you knew your stuff back then. And you had a young child at the time, and somehow you're doing all this. And I had I think I was probably not yet had my first son, but I was so impressed. Do you remember that time?
Yes, actually, my first memory of you is seeing you push the stroller in the planning department. And I started in Berkeley in November 1987, when Aaron was not quite 2 years old. I had always planned to go back to work. I had been working trying to work as a consultant while he was little, putting him in the baby seat on the desk. And of course, he'd get hungry while I was on a phone call. But Berkeley was actually the third job I had in planning in California. Mm-hmm. Actually, maybe the fourth job in California. Yeah, it's more than that. But I started as a planner in Manhattan. Where did you start?
I was in Boulder County. So I was an undergraduate in environmental conservation. I had barely even heard about planning, but when I was a junior, I started finding the classes I really wanted over in environmental design. And in Boulder, there's no planning program there per se, but there's a master's program in Denver. So I became like a planning junkie. It was, I wasn't really going to make it as a cartographer, my map making skills, and I don't think there was a big market for that as well, but I discovered planning and used to go to public hearings, was like going to a concert or a party, was so exciting at the time. And then that led me to Berkeley for my master's in environmental planning. So I got a free ride the first year. I didn't work. I just soaked in the wonderful stuff that UC Berkeley has to offer, and Worcester Hall. And, of course, loved living in Berkeley. And what a dream. I wound up in environmental consulting. And I don't know if you ever did a gig as a EIR jockey. That's what I called myself. But kind of got stuck in that area for a while, worked for LSA and some other firms with PAD, a small woman-owned boutique firm with Gloria Root that we might have come across each other.
Yes, I remember Gloria, and I actually am one of those planners who predates CEQA.
Oh, wow, okay.
What you said about not knowing about planning resonated, because when I graduated from the City College of New York in 1965.
Okay.
Planning wasn't on the radar. I had never heard of it as a profession. All I knew when I graduated with a degree in English Lit was how to run a newspaper because I had spent almost all of my time in college working on the newspaper, ended up being managing editor and then editor-in-chief. And I went to journalism school.
Oh.
I dropped out of journalism school. I think I was the only married woman in the class.
Yes.
And it was tough. My then husband had graduated a couple of years before me, but I remember telling the dean, I'm not sure that I want to be in journalism, but when I dropped out, all I really knew how to do was be a journalist. So I answered an ad in the New York Times, and I ended up working for a newspaper which in northern New Jersey, covering the town where the assistant dean lived, which was interesting. But my first exposure to planning was covering the Planning Commission. And writing stories for which ended up on the front page because there weren't many people doing news, so I ended up doing most of the front page myself. But I had a friend who was a planner. He was actually, I think, the second planner licensed in the state of New Jersey. And after I left this newspaper in New Jersey, I had written a letter to the New York Times to find out about getting a job there. And to my great surprise,
Very bold.
yeah, they hired me.
Oh, nice.
And I was a very, very young reporter when I started there in 1967, working for the famous Charlotte Curtis, who what she actually wanted to do was send another woman to Vietnam, because at that point, Gloria Emerson was the only female reporter in Vietnam. I never got to Vietnam, but I started freelancing for the real estate department as well as the news desk. And my friend Peter, this planner from New Jersey, he and another guy had started a consulting firm funded by OEO.
Okay.
So back in those days, OEO community development grants would fund community agencies to undertake projects. And what this firm helped them do was develop housing and deal with housing issues.
Before HUD.
HUD existed, but most of the funding at that point was actually from OEO.
Okay.
And so Peter kept giving me ideas for stories. And I remember one of the most frustrating experiences I had was he told me about what was going on on the Lower East Side. There had been which is where his firm was based and where they were focusing their work. He told me about a program that the city of New York had started, which had this great idea of putting buildings into receivership and having the rents paid into an account, which would then be drawn down on to make the repairs that were needed in the buildings. And what Peter told me was they had found out there was no money left in these escrow accounts, and none of the repairs had been made.
Ooh.
So I spent several days and weekends going through buildings on the Lower East Side with a worker, somebody who had been working for this agency on the Lower East Side. And I wrote a story, and I took it to Steve Roberts, who was then the housing reporter. That's Steve Roberts, who later married Cokie Roberts.
Oh.
That's Steve Roberts. And Steve said, yeah, I think it's a good story, should be published. So I took it to the Metropolitan editor, and he took a look at it and said, where's the news peg? It's not timely. They weren't interested in just investigating something. And I realized that what I was trying to do, what I thought one could do with journalism, is affect change.
Right.
And meanwhile, my friend Peter is saying, come and work for me, come and work for me. We need planners who can write.
Okay.
So in 1969, I became a planner. I started working on a master's at Pratt and working on the projects that Abelus Schwartz was undertaking. And one of their first big job was a master plan for the Lower East Side.
Back in the corruption,
Yeah,
whatever was going on.
Actually, Lindsay was the mayor.
I was going to ask, was it Lindsay?
Yeah, Lindsay was the mayor, and there was a lot of interesting stuff going on.
I remember, I was a kid, but I remember something about the times because, that era, because my father, who was a mechanical engineer and worked in industry, he had taught engineering in Pittsburgh, where he grew up. So he taught at Carnegie Tech, Carnegie Mellon now. But I'm the youngest of 6. So with 6 kids, professor salary didn't quite make it. So we moved to New Haven, Connecticut, where I grew up, and probably would have preferred Pittsburgh. But in any event, that's where I grew up. And he was the chair of the Zoning Board of Appeals under Dick Lee. So when you study your redevelopment history.
Met Dick Lee.
So he would, Clarence Tyler, my father, was his appointee to the zoning board. But it was very controversial because my father was Republican. He was a Rockefeller Republican. And they kicked him off the rolls for being appointed by the Democratic mayor for what was then a very powerful position.
Yeah.
But I do remember bringing plan sets around to the commissioners, seeing him with a gavel at the zoning board hearings. And even though I didn't really know what planning was, it made an impression, and it kind of fed into that. And you were actually working in that era. That's really not too far away, right?
Yeah. And I actually became friends with a guy who had worked for Dick Lee for the redevelopment agency.
Oh.
And he was actually a protege of Ed Logue.
Yes, and
So
my father knew
remember
him as
Ed
well.
Logue. And Ed and Dick Lee were good friends,
Yep.
but my friend Bob, who was working for, oh boy, I can't remember the name of the agency now, but it was the agency that was doing sort of the infrastructure, redevelopment, rehab. Al Walsh was the director then, and he was his chief deputy. He took me to the Yale Harvard football game. And we walk
In New Haven or
New Haven.
Cambridge? Okay.
And we walk into Dick Lee's kitchen, and there's Ed Logue sitting with a bottle of scotch, because Ed Logue almost always had a bottle of scotch. And I'm just,
Wow.
bedazzled
Yeah.
with these people that I was learning about in planning school.
Yeah. There they were. It was part of history. I mean, there's books about. So that's early history, and you were there.
It's really early history, and
Wow.
I mean, Pratt was an interesting experience. Had a program that was directed toward people who were working and going to school part-time. And this was in the middle of Vietnam,
Yeah.
trying times. I was at Pratt for 2 years. We never finished one semester. They went on strike
Yeah.
every single semester.
Yeah.
So when I moved to California in the late fall of 1971, I contacted Berkeley about going back and finishing my degree, and they wouldn't take any of my credits.
Oh, no.
And I said, hell, I'm not starting all over again.
Nothing to do with the substance. That's just
Yeah.
institutional competition.
Yeah, and I could have shown them all of my notes from the classes that we and we drove. A guy named George Raymond was the head of the department, and he ran a firm called Raymond May Parrish and Pine, also one of the first firms, and I mean, we just drove him nuts. He kept saying, because he would trying to teach introduction to planning, and
Right.
we were all very feisty. And, at one point he says, if you people don't want to be here, leave. You obviously are not interested and you're not taking this seriously. But we had a lot of really good instructors at Pratt, and he was pretty good. His assistant was a woman who had worked for the New Haven Redevelopment Agency, and Richard Bernstein was on the faculty. He had been the head of planning for New York City. The guy who's Nicholas Kristoff, Frank Kristoff, who's the father of Nicholas Kristoff, who works
Okay.
for the Times. He was I think was like a finance director for the city, and he taught finance. So we took a lot of it. There were a lot of good classes, but I came out to California, started investigating places to work.
What led you out to did you just want to move to California?
Yeah, I had come to California for a visit in 1968, took one look at San Francisco in May, and said, that's it, I'm leaving. I'm moving to California.
So the Summer of Love was that 67 or 68?
Yeah,
68 was May Day.
It
the
was
big
still
protest.
going on, and ironically, when I finally moved out in 71, I had a friend of a friend had a house in the Haight. So I lived on Masonic, in a commune on Masonic between Haight and Waller.
All right.
And the guy who owned the house and I were the only people who worked. I don't know what the rest of them were doing. But I started working for the National Housing and Economic Development Law Project,
Okay.
which was an OEO-funded project in Berkeley, then operating out of a sorority house
So it
because
was a nonprofit of the time.
yeah, it was a nonprofit. It was affiliated with Bolt Hall,
Okay.
which is not called Bolt Hall
Right, right.
anymore.
Law school.
But I wrote about housing. And
I was just thinking, did you ever imagine that decades later you would be doing this housing element troubleshooting that you've been doing recently?
Lots of housing elements. But I worked there for a while and met a lot of interesting people. I don't know if you remember Chester Hartman.
I remember the name.
Chester was one of the
A lot of acolytes.
he and I were the only two non-attorneys on the staff, and a number of other people who went on to have very illustrious careers. One guy who became, this is where my the names are I'm beginning to lose them, but Arnold, who was our contact guy in Washington, D.C., he was affiliated with the project. He went on to become director of HCD for the state, ironically, at the point that I was working for the state.
So who was president at this point?
It was in the...
Is it Nixon?
It was 1972, so it was Nixon.
Yeah.
There was one of
The environmental president, I used to tell my students.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting that Nixon and Reagan did some of the things that they did, which now we view as very progressive. But I worked
I might argue with you on Reagan, but anyway.
Well, but also as governor, did some interesting things. He was one of the people who helped get OPR to be what it ended being. So that was something.
That's something, yeah.
But I went from the law project. I had interviewed at ABAG when I came out, and the director at that time didn't want to hire me because I was a single woman. He said, well, she'll just up and leave and go someplace
So
else.
you wouldn't get hired if you're married, because you wouldn't get hired if you had kids.
Yeah.
If you're single, neither. Were they at the Claremont at that time?
They were at the Claremont, so I am
that.
one of
Very
the Claremont bunch, and there were a lot of interesting people worked there.
I remember going over there in that beautiful hotel resort.
Yeah, it was such a fun place to work. And one of the people who worked there was Dean Macris.
Okay.
Because this was the period when he was supposed to be the planning director in San Francisco, but they have a charter requirement that the planning director lives in San Francisco. So Dean is married to Marge Macris, who's the planning director of Marin County.
Right.
And so what's he supposed to do? So he commutes back and forth.
Right.
And that wouldn't wash. So he just left and he came to ABAG, where he was one of the people who was leading the planning effort.
The residency led him away from San Francisco? The residency requirement, and then Marge went to Berkeley, where I worked.
Well, that was after she retired from Marin, but she had the two kids, Natalie, who became a planner, and Eric, and they were living in Marin County.
Okay, Mill Valley, I think.
In Mill Valley,
the
house that Marge always lived in Mill Valley. And he was in San Francisco, and
I know that.
they, that was just absurd.
So such a power couple at the time. I remember Gloria Root, who I worked for, and she was in San Francisco, very fancy person, very stylish. And
she had been a Playboy bunny.
I found that up. I think Bunny of the Year, and but that was all before. That was when she was a student at RISD. And she was sort of their hippie bunny, but more stories there. Anyway, I don't know if we're running out of time. But one thing with ABAG, why did I go there? I went to look up documents because there was no internet. There was no, you couldn't find this stuff. You had to physically go to the library and know what you were doing. I used to work as a librarian, a library assistant, if you will, in school. So I knew how to look up government documents. And that's what you had to do. So it was for a project at Berkeley that you had to go visit ABAG, know what you're looking for, talk to people, find it, discover it, not just, do a little AI Google search. So that's it's just one of the many ways things have changed.
One of the things that helped to create that library at ABAG, when I was at ABAG, initially I was hired to work on A95 review. I don't know if you remember that, but
just towards the end.
Yeah. OMB Circular A95 was based on a set of federal regulations based on the very reasonable notion that you should make sure that when you're giving federal funds, they're not working at cross purposes.
Right.
So you don't give funding to build a freeway interchange where where HUD was putting in housing on the same site.
Yeah.
So the idea was that the councils of government, which were called then area-wide planning organizations or metropolitan planning organizations, would notify the local jurisdictions if they saw potential. They would review the applications and make sure that there weren't any conflicts. Well, the problem was that at the point that agencies went to the federal government to get funding for a project, it had already been through the local planning process.
Right.
And meanwhile, we've got this new thing called environmental review. I had
And this was CEQA, not NEPA.
CEQA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 74, 75, that came
Right.
in. Yep.
Because I went to ABAG in 72. And one of the things that I did was I drafted a letter for the executive director to send to every member jurisdiction saying, when you do environmental review, send us a copy. And that was the beginning of the ABAG library. Because we put all of the environmental documents in the library.
Okay.
And the idea was that we would do a review then, because one of the requirements in CEQA is it conflicting with land use policy.
Right.
And since we had been funded, ABAG, had been funded to do a plan for the Bay Area, and it had just been released, the first Bay Area plan.
Yeah.
And that had been funded by HUD. You had all of these HUD-funded plans.
HUD was meaningful.
Yeah, it really meant something.
It was, yeah.
And the idea was we would say whether there was a conflict with the regional plan. And if there was a conflict, what we had actually the power to do was notify the federal agency that there was a conflict, and the potential was there that the federal agency would say, we're not going to fund the project.
Yeah.
So ABAG potentially and all of the other councils of government were very, very powerful.
There's a line of accountability that's been so frayed and frazzled and
Right.
yeah.
Right.
Are we going to have time to talk about what we were talking about before?
So
Because,
I think we should. Well, we can jump ahead.
Yeah, well, jump ahead now.
So
Yeah.
I'll go from ABAG. I went to OPR, and then I moved to Seattle in 1978. Came back in 85, and went to Berkeley in 87. And after I retired from Berkeley, I went to work for Diet and Boccia, where I wrote zoning,
Right, that's right.
which sort of got me to the point where I retired a year ago, June. But one of the things I did in the 90s was I got elected to the APA National Board.
Okay,
I
you're
was
a director.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was the director for Region 6. And we were sort of identified as we were the California troublemakers.
Who was president at that time? Do you recall?
Eric Kelly was initially
Okay.
the land use attorney, professor at Ball State University, and then a number of other people, Mary Kay Peck. I can't even remember all the names.
And so was the Director?
Frank So was,
Yes,
he had,
so we had a planner as director.
right.
Yeah,
So it was interesting.
before Farmer, yeah.
Yeah, and I was involved in the selection of Farmer, which
Okay.
was supposedly positive because he was a planner.
Yeah,
Which everybody thought, oh, that's wonderful.
Right.
But I was also there when Norm Krumholtz was the head of AICP. I became very good friends with Norm,
yeah.
who was the person initially who started talking about equity and planning.
yeah.
He wrote the book on equity.
And AICP started well after. See, I remember
Yeah.
when AIP and ASPO, I actually was a member before. I was a charter member of APA. I was still a kid in college, 78, I think. They combined, and then
Right.
AICP followed a few years later.
Yeah,
and
it
it's
was
like
actually
84 or,
they started they gave a written exam for AICP. I had declined to take the oral exam prior to the formation of AICP. Well, it had been AIP,
right.
and you were deemed eligible by some experienced old white guy who would interview you.
Grandfathered.
Yeah. And I refused to have some guy. And one of the guys who was doing the interviews was somebody with who had worked for me at OPR, who had been a great planner in his heyday, but had become an alcoholic. And I said, look, I am not going to sit for an interview by him.
Yeah.
That just doesn't make sense. So I waited, and as soon as they
It's
started,
really the good old boy system.
Yeah.
These oral interviews. Yeah.
and I waited until they started giving the oral exams, and I took the exam in 1978.
written exam.
The written exam, and I took it the first year that it was given. And I was in Seattle at the time.
Yeah.
Took it up there. So I'm a charter member of AICP,
Okay.
and I was in the first group. They actually gave the exam twice that year because so many people had signed up, and I think I was in the second batch that signed up.
I did 84. I was like a junior member of AICP. So, yeah, I'll have to look and see who signed it back then.
Yeah. Well, I know Frank So signed my certificate wherever it is, but and then I was on the board when they started FAICP, and I was one of the first female members of FAICP. They had actually changed the requirement from initially they wanted you to have 25 years of experience.
Wow.
I guess to become, was it 25 or 15? But there weren't enough women who met that requirement, so they changed it. But I was in...
Now it's 10. They dropped it to 10.
So they dropped it again. But I went FAICP in 2000.
So I did 2008, really because there were no FAICP women in Illinois, which is one of the top planning states, with the University of Illinois. And I was in Urbana at the time. I'd met Rob
I remember.
at Berkeley, and he got his PhD, and I went out and started working after my master's, but then he got a job teaching there. So then I became the trailing spouse, and the practice of planning was very different than in California. So I was underemployed and eventually did become community development director for Urbana, which was a great job.
I remember going to a panel that you did at one of the conferences on group housing, which was a big issue I was dealing with in Berkeley. But the group, when I went FAICP, my year was Janet Ruggiero, Marge Macris, Margarita McCoy. There were Gloria, and I can't remember her last name. It wasn't Gloria Root, but there was a Gloria who had been one of the first women planning directors in Yolo County.
Okay. There were only 10% in my year in 2008, that late there were only 10% women. And for minority, persons of color, very few. And so this whole thing with FAICP being a barrier really became an issue. It still is a big issue. So they've tried to streamline it. But the division, I was on the divisions council with the Planning and Women division, and they really got bold about it. And they said, "Hey, we want equity here, and this is our timeline. This is what we want to understand the pipeline." But it's still too difficult. It's still not transparent enough. It's better, and it's recognized. But we wanted to talk about how APA is helping and not helping us right now under our current circumstances.
Yeah, and equity became an issue with APA when I was on the board. We started working on a policy paper on equity.
Yeah.
Relied pretty heavily on the work that Norm Krumholtz and Paul Davidoff
I remember that document.
had done.
Yeah.
And they developed the principles, which was all good. There was some pushback from some states, but I remember one of my good friends when I was on the board was a guy from Mississippi. There were a lot of good people on the board at that time, and even though, California we were considered the wild ones. I remember when they were going to have the conference in San Francisco, and I warned them that the Marriott was on strike. And I said, I'll tell you, if you hold a conference in San Francisco, have the Marriott as your headquarters hotel, and they are on strike, you will not have any elected officials attending.
Right.
And you probably will have a lot of planners who won't cross the picket lines either.
Yeah.
It's like, oh boy, here we go again.
Troublemaker.
With the troublemakers from California. So I guess that gets us to where we are now, and us troublemakers in California are still making trouble. And I have sent you and Hanson and some other people a letter that Pete Parkinson, who is a former president of the chapter, former planning director of Sonoma County, and he's a neighbor of mine now, lives not too far away in Sonoma County, but he and I are both incensed, frustrated, aggravated, and aghast at APA and AICP's mealy-mouthed, spineless response to what's going on in Washington.
Yeah.
And
The lack of, I feel also just a lack of support, coherent support for what our members are going through in their daily lives and their work life, and trying to navigate, the censorship and the erasure and loss of grants and, the work that's meaningful to us and that is completely in line with our code of ethics.
And that's the big issue that I remember the question that Ralph Wilmer, who's the equity person
Ethics
now.
officer, yeah.
And he was on the board with me when I was. Decent guy, but it's sort of like, how do you get around the AICP code of ethics if the people you work for tell you what you...
It was a wink and a nod type of advice that, and one thing I got from his message was, look, if if someone complains about you not doing ethical, good planning work, we're going to overlook that. So we're not going to, I remember one thing he says, we're not going to throw you under the bus if if somebody rats on you for dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, right?
Rather than saying that if you stand up for what planners
Yeah.
supposedly believe in, if you stand up for the ethical principles that underlie planning, that certainly are one of the reasons why I got into planning, we're going to back you up. That's what they should be saying. Instead, it's we're going to help you.
The messaging is not there. I think that, and I almost have thought that if Angela Brooks had been president this year, or Mitch Silver, for that matter, who was president not too long ago, we would have had very different messaging.
Yeah.
It's been very mild, non-existent. The mealy, it's been confusing and disappointing. And I tell you, probably shouldn't talk about it too much, but I'm the EDI chair and have been. I've been involved with the diversity. It was a committee and a task force and a committee, and then it more and more got integrated. Those efforts more and more got integrated into the everyday. So we didn't have just one diversity summit. We would have a large portion of a conference devoted to diversity and equity topics. So it changed the conversation, but the need is still there. And yet it's it's not what it used to be. It's a very small program, insignificant program, and we're not meeting very regularly. I really have to push to meet, but our members want to talk about this. They want to talk about this in a safe way and where they can be open and share tips. And the only meeting I've had with APA was behind closed doors, planning for health equity interest group at the conference. And we really got to talk about what is it like right now in Florida? How are you coping?
Yeah.
And it was very illuminating. And we need to be helping each other, but there are no forums right now that are allowing that.
That's what, for starters, I just find it fascinating that HCD and OPR or whatever
it's called
now, have essentially said nothing about this. HCD still requires that you do an affirmatively furthering fair housing.
Right. But there are no funds for this. We have no redevelopment funds in California.
And OPR still wants you to do an environmental justice element.
Right.
What I'd like to hear is, I want to know, are there planners who are getting, in California, who are getting pushback from their councils or their planning commissions or their boards of supervisors about doing this work? Are they being told, change the plan because we're worried about losing funding?
Yeah.
I live in Sonoma County. Sonoma County just sent out a notice, we're adopting our environmental justice element, so they don't care.
Well, and I guess at least in this state, we're able to do this type of work. It doesn't mean we'll keep all our funding, but one thing that we haven't recovered from is the Zoom bombing, and we're still not getting meaningful public engagement because of the behaviors from other states, primarily of the hate crimes or hate speech, rather, I should say, that were being bombed into our meetings. So, we're really having a hard time, with all of this. So, what next?
Well, I'm sorry I'm not going to the state conference this year because I would like to talk about that. I would hope it's discussed at the state conference. We should talk to Miru about bringing it up at the diversity summit.
Yeah.
I think the chapter has got to take a leadership role, has got to tell planners and planning commissions, we've got your back.
Right.
We still believe that this is what planning is about.
Yeah.
And regardless of what's going on in Washington, we'll defend you. I mean, there used to be a planner support effort for planners who lost their jobs
Right.
for economic reasons. What about planners who lose their jobs for political reasons?
Yes.
I want to see APA doing something about that.
Support, because we all know there are people in that situation, and they're not feeling like they can really talk about it.
Yeah, and
Easily.
I'm being a big mouth, as my former assistant city manager and city manager in Berkeley used to say. I lead with my chin. And yeah, I know I got in trouble because I was pushing to get more affordable housing, more multifamily housing, but it's what I believed in.
Yeah.
It's what I thought you should do as a planner. Now HCD is telling you to do it, although that's a whole nother discussion we
But
could have.
without the resources.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's interesting thinking back to the 60s. It was really, planning, was a little more in its modern infancy, I should say, but it had that federal support. It had standing. It had status. It was, one of those, architecture, engineering, planning, city planning. There was hope in the
If you
future.
come in with a classically designed, classic
Well, of
style
course.
building, then they'll give you support.
Yeah. But here we are, and pulled in lots of different directions. And it's hard to know what we should do next, but we should be firm. And one thing in talking with you, I just love that you've been consistently what I like to call, it's a positive term, a lefty. I love that you've been consistently a great lefty planner throughout. So, you've been a great role model, I
Well,
think.
thank you.
And yeah, I mean, I have my stodgy side, but I definitely, I admire the people who lead with their chin and the rebels and the big mouths. And I have a little bit of that in me, but, I'm also play by the rules a lot too. So I've got a little split personality there. But yeah, I was a little troublemaker too in the Divisions Council when they wanted to sunset, they called it, all the smaller population-driven divisions. And I said, well, gee, just doesn't fit with our diversity effort here.
Because it's identity politics.
Yeah, whatever. Well, it was economic, and this was Paul towards the end of his tenure when it wasn't going as well. It was like, well, you only have 200 members, therefore we're not going to give you any staff support. Well, come on, this is the planning in the Black community and women in planning and Latinos in planning, and at the time gays and lesbians in planning. It's been rebranded, but sure, then where are we if we're our interest groups are sunsetted? So that wasn't too terribly long ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so keep up the good fight now
Oh,
that you're in a position with APA, and get that message out there.
Yeah, I think
California,
Monterey is a place to start.
Yeah.
We have an unconference space, which I think is pretty cool. Allison Joe is our diversity chair, and she has great ideas and,
I know
a very
Allison,
creative
she's
person.
a good
So,
woman. Yes.
yeah. So, there's a contingency, and even if it has to be kind of that little side group in the corner making trouble, then we just have to keep doing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
Wow. Okay. Are we given time yet, or?
Yep.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been lovely.